So I have had a great time in the town, so thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for coming out. If I did this in Miami, there'd be 8 people there, because we have beaches and mojitos, so why go to see a stodgy professor when you have that? I wish I could give you some sexy romantic story about how I started studying this topic. I mean, the story I would like to tell is something like this. Like, I was born on 9/11, and because I'm a New York Yankees fan, I went to see the Yankees Red Sox on my 26th birthday, and then we were attacked by terrorists, and then I saw what happened and the carnage that was caused, and then over the years I saw the conspiracy theories develop, and this is how I got into it. Well, none of that is true, except for the part that 9/11 is my birthday, and I was there for the attacks of 9/11, but that's not how I got into the topic. It's just a much better story than the truth, which is somebody knocked on my door and said, "Hey, do you want to do this?" And my answer was an immediate no. I said, "This is the dumbest topic we could waste time on." I said, "Nobody cares about this. You're going to destroy our careers if we get into this. It's a sinkhole." And I gave the right answer at the time, because 15 years ago, no one was really paying attention to this. It was a very different time. And just to put that in numerical terms, when I first started looking into the topic, I set up what's called a Google alert on it. So every night I would get an email with all the newspaper articles that had the word conspiracy theory in it. And in 2009, I was getting back 3 or 4 articles published nationwide that had conspiracy theory in it. No one really cared. Not a big topic. By 2015, it was 100 articles every day, and that has not stopped. And I'm in, I think, a lot of them. And I could just tell you, in 2010, no one was calling me to talk about this topic, even though I was one of the few people studying it. In 2020, I took 300 interviews, only talking about conspiracy theories, and mostly on COVID and QAnon. So people are talking about it now, and people care. But you can remember a time when we didn't care so much. And that's not to say that conspiracy theories weren't always here and that they didn't exist in one form or another, but we weren't watching them. And that's sort of where I want to start my talk this evening. So the media is talking a lot about this. So the question becomes, what are they saying? Well, if you read the news, The Economist is saying that from the Congo to the Capitol, conspiracy theories are surging. If you read Politico, we are now in the golden age of conspiracy theorizing. And if you read the Washington Post, they're asking you, will you fall down the conspiracy theory rabbit hole? And yes, this is the Washington Post and not Cosmo, but you can take the quiz and find out if you have fallen down the rabbit hole. And all of these stories have to have a villain. There has to be an explanation. Somebody must be doing it. It can't just happen, right? So if you look through the headlines, we could sort of tell who's getting blamed quite a bit, and that's social media. At the beginning of the pandemic, this video came out called Plandemic, and it said everything was planned, but if you walked barefoot on the beach sand, it would cure you of your coronavirus. I do that a lot. It doesn't cure me of anything, but it's still fun. On Twitter, the bots are spreading the conspiracy theories, and on TikTok, there's election misinformation everywhere. So we're blaming social media quite a bit for whatever our current state of affairs is right now. And even the president has gotten into this, of social media. In the last year, he said the following: social media platforms are immoral, they're killing people, and it has to stop. And Democrats are putting forward legislation to try and punish social media platforms if they allow, in particular, health misinformation on their platforms. Now, when I said villain, I meant it quite literally, because here are some headlines. Zuckerberg is the modern Bond villain, and he's coming for your children, and if he catches them early, they'll never be able to escape. Well, Yeah, I don't know if he's that much of a Bond villain, and he's not very good at catching children because Facebook has been sieving people under 50 for the last 6 years. So, but nonetheless, that's sort of the narrative. So, what are the journalists saying in general about conspiracy theories? In short, that conspiracy theory beliefs are increasing across the board, that everyone is becoming more conspiratorial, and that social media is the most proximate cause for this state of affairs. And the public is convinced of this narrative too. So the majority of Americans think that conspiracy theories are currently, quote, out of control. A majority of Americans think that conspiracy theories are more popular than they were 25 years ago. And the vast majority of Americans believe that social media is to blame for all of this. And what we see as a response to these sentiments are calls for restrictive policies. So a typical op-ed say, Congress needs to hold these platforms accountable because they're turning everyone into a conspiracy theorist. Well, there are good reasons to be concerned about conspiracy theories, of course, right? If people believe ideas that are untethered to our shared reality, they could act on those ideas, and the consequences could potentially be deadly. Conspiracy theories can also lead to mass distrust. If we think everything is rigged, we're not going to take part. We're not going to trust other people. And at the end of the day, if we think that powerful people are out to get us, well, we may want to fight fire with fire and get them first. And we've seen too many instances of deadly violence. But doing something about it with policy comes with a lot of very serious implications. So the first is that when we start regulating technology, we have to understand that Congress isn't that smart when it comes to tech stuff. I mean, these people are very old, and if you listen to some of the questions they ask about technology, it's clear they didn't grow up with it, they don't fully understand it, and it's just something that's very foreign to them. So to allow them to start writing bills on the topic might not work out so good. The next point is that once you start regulating marketplaces, it's going to halt innovation, and it can seriously damage our choices as consumers online. Now, when Mark Zuckerberg was hauled in front of the Senate, he was asked by Senator Lindsey Graham, if we wanted to pass legislation to address some of these problems, will you help us? Zuckerberg said, of course, I'd love to. The next time he showed up at the Capitol building, he showed up with a bill already written. He said, here it is. Why would we want a huge competitor in the market writing the laws that would do this, right? But that's what's going to happen, right? Is that Congress tends to outsource a lot of these things because they don't have expertise in everything that they write, and it would go to the lobbyists and the big companies, and of course they're going to write laws that solidify their market position. But even more important than any of that, conspiracy theories can be an important part of free speech, whether you believe them or not. And who are we going to elect that we would want to decide what's true and what's not for us? And who would we want to give the power to censor our ideas? I mean, you may feel comfortable now saying, oh, I would like this president to appoint people who would decide. But do you want the other party to decide what's true and then start censoring ideas? Most of us probably wouldn't. And once you start thinking about, how do we know what's a conspiracy theory and what's not? How do we know which ones are true and which not? It's far more complicated than it at first seems, right? So those aren't things that we want to tread lightly on. And more than that, once you start saying we're going to start punishing you for certain ideas, then people shut up. You chill speech. They don't want to share anything for fear that they're going to get in trouble. And there is always collateral damage too. Because Congress has been pushing the social media companies to take down conspiracy theories, they have taken down a lot of true stuff. And that hurts everyone. And they've stifled important debates, even though the information they've taken down is true. So we have to be very careful with these sorts of things before we give the government the power to decide for us what we can and can't see or say. So in this talk, I am going to quickly define conspiracy theory. I'm going to explain why people believe them or not. I am going to compare the narratives that we are seeing in the news to what the evidence I've been collecting shows over the last decade. And then I'm going to talk about why there are differences between what we're hearing in the media and what the systematic data have to say about these issues. So a conspiracy we take as a real thing, and in the way I use the term conspiracy, I'm not using it to talk about simply legal conspiracies, like two guys tried to knock over the ice cream truck to get the money. I'm talking about large-scale conspiracies. So in that sense, my definition is a small group of powerful people working in secret for their own benefit against the common good and in a way that undermines our bedrock ground rules against the widespread use of force and fraud. Good example is Watergate, where Richard Nixon and his associates undermined the Constitution. Why do we call it a conspiracy and not a conspiracy theory? Because the experts and the authorities that would investigate these things have done so. They came to the conclusion that this actually did happen. We have admissions in open court. There are investigations by the FBI and Congress. So we know what happened. Now, a conspiracy theory has all those same elements. It's just a little bit different. So it's an accusatory perception in which a small group of powerful people were working in secret for their own benefit against the common good, and in a way that undermines our bedrock ground rules against the widespread use of force and fraud. And the scheme could have happened in the past, it could be going on now, or it could be anticipated to happen in the future. But we're not sure if it's true. And the reason we're not sure is because the experts that would investigate it, the experts that would look into it, either haven't done so yet or haven't determined that that particular theory actually occurred. So this isn't to say that because I call something a conspiracy theory, it's necessarily false. Could be true. It just means the experts haven't figured that out yet, right? And maybe they will in the future. So if you think that the CIA or the Mafia or Castro or the Soviets killed Kennedy in 1963, you're engaging in conspiracy theory. You could be right, and maybe one day you'll be proven correct after the CIA, releases all their documents, but for now it's conspiracy theory. So why do people believe conspiracy theories? Well, the most simple answer I like to give is for a lot of reasons, and for the same reasons people believe everything else, right? Oftentimes you go up to someone and say, well, why do you believe X? They'll say, well, because it's true. And then the question becomes, well, why do you think it's true? And then, well, I don't know, right? But what seems to undergird a lot of our beliefs are our group identities, our dispositions, and then our information environments. So you can think of, why does anyone come to any particular belief? Well, it's because they have information coming in all day. That information gets laid over the top of our personalities, our predispositions, our group identities, which allow us to interpret that information. And then that leads us to have a specific belief. So just to put this in political left-right terms, if you were to tell a Republican right now about how the economy's doing, they'll say, aha, the economy's terrible and it's all Biden's fault. If you tell a Democrat how the economy's doing, the Democrat will say, things are going good and thank God for Joe Biden. Same information, completely different conclusion, based completely on who they are as a person. So with that in mind, what are our group attachments? Well, our most important one when it comes to politics is our partisanship. And when people are Republicans or Democrats, they're seeing the world through very different lenses, and they're coming to very different conclusions about things, just for the fact of who they are. So because you're a Republican or a Democrat, that's going to lead you to seek out different information than you would if you were in the other party. You know, Republicans are watching maybe one channel, and Democrats might be watching every other channel. I don't know which ones. So people seek out the news that's going to make them feel good. If you like one channel, you put on the other one, and you watch news that's not congenial to your views, it's going to be kind of, I hate this. Let me put on my channel so I can feel good again. So people like seeking out information that tells them what they want to hear. And then we have psychological filters. So something's going to come in that tells us what we don't want to hear, what we don't want to believe, what we already disagree with, and block it right out. Right? So putting those two things together, people self-selecting their information and filtering out that which they don't already agree, you wind up with people just getting what they want, and there not being really room for opinion change. Another issue that goes on is that depending on what groups you belong to, that determines who you trust and who your opinion leaders are. So if you follow one particular politician, you're going to listen to what that person says, and you're going to give them a lot of credence. But if you were to listen to a different politician, you might follow what they say, right? So Democrats are listening to what Democrat leaders say, and Republicans are listening to what Republican leaders say. So they're getting very different information flows, and they believe very different people. So that's why people are coming to very different conclusions about the world. And then our political circumstances that we find ourselves in. So if you're on the losing side of an election, it was rigged. We were cheated. If you're on the winning side, of course, it was hunky-dory. And this happens after every election. The winners are always happy, and the losers are always upset, in politics as in sports. I've developed a theory called conspiracy theories are for losers because of this. This has not endeared me to any conspiracy theorists, but I mean it descriptively, not pejoratively, but of course they don't care. But what we find, like clockwork, is the losing side always thinks they were cheated. You know, watch the football game this weekend. Whoever loses will complain about the refs, but the winners will not. And this is the same thing in our politics. And then on top of our group attachments, we also have a set of dispositions within us, and I'm going to just focus on one. And that's what I call conspiracy thinking. Is that to one degree or another, each of us has a lens through which we see the world, and that lens determines how much we look out the window and see conspiracies everywhere. Some of us have it very strongly, where it's conspiracies control everything. Some of us have it very weakly, so when we come across a conspiracy theory, we're very unlikely to buy into it. Most people are somewhere in the middle, but there are people on both ends, and neither end is good. If you are on the high end, you're going to wind up believing in a lot of conspiracy theories that probably aren't true, and you're biased in that direction. But if you're on the low end, we actually find that these folks disbelieve conspiracies that really did happen. So they're making a different set of mistakes, which is probably equally bad. So on our surveys, we can measure this underlying disposition, and we give people sort of innocuous statements like this. You know, our lives are being controlled by plots hatched in secret places. Even though we're in a democracy, only a few people will always run things. The people who really run the country aren't known to the voters. Some people strongly agree with these ideas. Other people aren't so sure. Some people strongly disagree. But what we find is that when we ask people these questions on our surveys, we can develop a score for each of our survey respondents. And that score is incredibly predictive of how many conspiracy theories they buy into. So essentially they have this underlying worldview that leads them just to be more likely to think conspiracy theories are true. And then finally, our information environments. Exposure matters. Of course, at the same time, Who we are determines what we expose ourselves to and what we allow ourselves to believe or not. But our information environment does matter greatly. So, just to sum up, why do people believe these ideas? Well, it's a handful of factors, and those factors aren't that different from any other idea we might buy into. But it's no one thing. So let me just give you a handful of ideas. I promise to upset everyone in the room with my examples, so I'm not going to be one-sided. So climate change. Why do Republicans believe that climate change was fake? Normally we're getting, between 30 and, 70% of Republicans saying that some form of climate change conspiracy is going on. Well, why? Why just Republicans? Well, Republican leaders have been saying this for 30 years. Why have Republican leaders been saying this? Because the carbon-emitting industries went to conservative leaders 30 years ago and said, we need help here. We obviously don't want our business destroyed by doing something about carbon emissions. So let's sow doubt about the scientific consensus on this. And they did. And there's Senator Jim Imhoff. He walked onto the floor of the Senate in April with a snowball. And he said, well, it's snowed outside, so this proves climate change isn't happening. Right? And he wrote a book called, I think it's The Greatest Hoax or something like that. But Republicans and the mass public are getting these cues from their leaders for 30 years. And that's why Republicans believe it and Democrats don't. Democratic leaders saying this is real and we have to do something. And which Republicans are most likely to believe it? Well, those who already are somewhat predisposed to buy into conspiracy theories. Flip the coin. Who believes that Trump conspired with Russia to rig the election in 2016? Well, not Trump supporters, obviously. It's people on the left. And why do they believe that? Well, one, they lost in 2016. They wouldn't complain otherwise. But liberal and leaders and Democrats pushed the idea for a long time. And there were headlines saying that Trump is a Russian agent. Even after the Mueller report came out saying Trump's not a Russian agent, people doubled down and said, Trump's a Russian agent and I was right all along. It's like, no, you weren't. But you put these factors together, losing, cues coming from Democratic elites, and a disposition towards conspiracy theorizing, and what you found on surveys for the last few years is that Democrats with higher levels of conspiracy thinking most likely to think that Trump was engaged in a conspiracy to rig the election with Russia. And voter fraud, again, flip the coin to the other side. Normally you get 30 to 40% of the losing side thinking it was rigged against them. That's very normal. When I poll before an election, I get 30 to 40% of each side thinking it will be rigged. Of course, after the election, it's only the losers who say we were cheated. And it doesn't matter which side. Right now, about 70% of Republicans think the election was rigged against Trump. 30 to 40% would be normal. Why is it so high now? Well, because normally after an election, you don't have the losing president and lots of people in Congress and much of the ideological media saying it was rigged. But that's what you have right now, and that's why the beliefs are as high as they are. So it's not shocking that people think it was rigged. It's quite normal. It's just the amount that think it was rigged is a departure from the past. So I'm going to give 4 claims that we're getting from the media now, and then I'm going to show some data that I've been collecting for the last decade and say, are these claims true or not? So first claim, you're living in the golden age of conspiracy theorizing. This is it. You're in it. Well, this is a recent headline, but I was skeptical of it when I saw it. The reason is because they've been giving the same headline for the last 60 years. They do it a lot more now, but you could find them saying this in the 1960s. And they've never said it with any data to back it up. So that should be immediately concerning. So if I was going to put this idea to the test, my expectation would be something like this. That beliefs in conspiracy theories now would be higher than at any time in the past, if it was indeed the golden age. So if we were to look at numerous conspiracy theories, would we find this slope going upward in belief over time? Well, let's just take Kennedy conspiracy theories, for example, just to start out. Shortly after the president was killed in 1963, Gallup did a poll, and they said, do you think it was one shooter, or was there a broader conspiracy involved? 50% of Americans said it was a conspiracy. By 1975, it hit 80% believed it was a conspiracy. That number's only come down in the internet and social media era. Till now, when I poll on it, I get between 45 and 55%. So it's about back to where it was when it started. But what this sort of tells us is you don't need an internet for conspiracy theories to be incredibly popular. So when COVID first hit, I happened to have a poll about to go out in early March of 2020, and I said, oh gosh, this is happening, let's get some items on our poll. So I put 2 COVID items on our March 2020 survey. And the first one is the pandemic being exaggerated to hurt President Trump in the election year? And the other one I put on is coronavirus a bioweapon, intentionally made and intentionally spread to hurt people. We got about 30% on both of them in March 2020. We followed up in June 2020, flat, no increases. We followed up again in October of 2020, again, no increases. And then for the bioweapon one, we followed up the following summer and no increases. So this was a time, if you remember in 2020, everyone was talking, oh my God, the misinformation, the conspiracy theories, they're growing out of control. We found no evidence of this. People either bought in or they didn't, and the beliefs were stable over long periods of time. So when this video came out, which made a big splash in the mainstream news with everybody talking about it, oh my God, the pandemic, it's been shared millions of times, it's going to make everyone into a conspiracy theorist, the people who were sharing it probably already believed it. And even when something is shared a few million times, that really doesn't mean that it's affecting that many people, because again, we're a country of 340 or 50 million. I also looked at a whole bunch of other conspiracy theories starting in June of 2020, whether it was Bill Gates, whether it was getting chips in our neck, whether it was getting poison vaccines, whether it was about hydroxychloroquine, or spraying yourself with Lysol to cure your COVID. None of these increased over the course of an entire year. What they were in the first summer of COVID, they were in the next summer of COVID, or they dipped. So what we found throughout the pandemic, and we're still polling on these things, and again, not finding increases, is that it was the same people believing the same things during COVID. So prior to COVID, people were believing conspiracy theories about AIDS, about bird flu, about swine flu. The same people who thought MMR vaccine was part of a scam thought the COVID one was too. The people who thought that Bill Gates was behind everything during COVID, well, before COVID, they thought it was George Soros or the Koch brothers or the Rothschilds or the Rockefellers or the Kennedys. It's the same sentence, the same theory, but over time, they just changed the noun to adapt to new circumstances. And that's it. So as wild and wacky as some conspiracy theorists seem, once you start looking at them over and over and over again, as I tell my students, they get really boring. It's as if the conspiracy theorists don't have a lot of creativity because it's sort of the same stuff. So next example, how about QAnon? If you're not familiar with that, it's the idea that there's a secret agent named Q who was working with President Trump to take out the satanic deep state, which is involved in child eating and pedophilia. And if you recognize him, he was one of the guys who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, 2021. He's now in prison. But his name is the QAnon shaman, and he paints his face and wears horns, because that's what he believes in. Throughout 2020, the media was telling us over and over again, QAnon is big and getting bigger. Everyone's buying in, it's taking over the country, it's already taking over the GOP. Oh my God, it's everywhere. Well, no, there was never good evidence for this. I mean, in 2018, I ran a poll in Florida on QAnon and found that it was about as popular as Fidel Castro. And if you know anything about Florida, where I'm from, we don't like Castro. We danced in the street when he died. So that was no stunning endorsement of QAnon. In 2019, there was a poll by Emerson University polling, and it was about 5% of Americans said, yes, I'm a believer in QAnon. Pew did a poll in early 2020 where only 3% of Americans knew a lot about it. About 25% knew a little. But of everyone who knew anything about it, most of them were learning about it from the New York Times, the Washington Post, or NPR, not from 8chan, right? So again, going into the pandemic, this wasn't a big thing. So one of the things that I started doing in 2018 was doing surveys where I give people what's called a feeling thermometer. And I say, on a scale of 0 to 100, tell me how much you like QAnon, with 100 being you really like it and you're into it, and 0, you hate it. The average on our first poll was about a 23, 24, so not particularly good. It never went up by very much, and over the course of 2 years, it went down by about 8 points, till the last poll that we have here was about a 16. So again, as this became a bigger thing in the news and more people knew what it was, it became less liked, not more liked. Now, just to broaden out, I recently completed a project where we went back to survey archives and found every poll that had been done in the last 60 years asking about a conspiracy theory to a nationwide sample of Americans. We then went back and re-polled those exact same survey items. So we had about 37 conspiracy theories that we wound up asking about. And the time difference between the waves was between 60 years and about half a year. The vast majority of those conspiracy theories either went down or stayed the same over time. Only a handful went up, and the decreases over time were much larger than the increases over time. So again, what we found was that conspiracy theories might be popular at any given time, but they're going to go down over time. So it's never really the case that we're just seeing increases across the board or increases in these beliefs writ large. So how about the idea that just conspiracy thinking, that maybe it's not that people are believing individual conspiracy theories more, maybe it's just they just have this mindset more. Well, as I mentioned, we're able to measure this on our surveys, and we've been doing it for a decade, and that's the trend line from 2012 to 2021. Never increased. It was flat over time. So it's not the case that people are just becoming more conspiratorial in their worldviews. How about the idea that conspiracy theory beliefs are more prevalent on the right? And this is the part where I'm going to upset the left. This has been common knowledge since Richard Hofstadter wrote about the topic in the 1960s, saying that the Americans have a paranoid style, and he concentrated most of this on the extreme right of the late 50s and early 60s. Well, is that really the case? If we start surveying people, are we going to find that conservatives are far more conspiratorial than liberals? Well, let me take an easy example, and that's QAnon. Whenever you read about QAnon, journalists tend to say it's a far-right conspiracy theory, or it's extreme right conspiracy theory. The problem with the reporting on it is they never tell you what far-right or extreme right means, and usually in the same sentence they will say something like, this far-right conspiracy theory is going mainstream. Well, how can something be both far and extreme and also mainstream at the same time? The answer is it can't. So in 2019, we asked the question, are you a believer in QAnon? We got about 5%, and that was even between both sides. 6% of Republicans and 6% of Democrats said they were believers in QAnon. No evidence that it was far right. Followed this up 2 years later, said, are you a believer in QAnon in our national sample? Again, we got about the same number, and it was 6.5% Democrats said yes, only about 5% of Republicans said yes. Just to put those numbers in comparison, the gray bar there is beliefs in Kennedy conspiracy theories, which on that survey was about 55%. So QAnon is tiny compared to these bigger, long-standing conspiracy theories. So again, no evidence that it's more one side than the other. And also, you probably can't see that too well, but we just completed a project where we asked 52 conspiracy theories on a recent survey, and then looked at people's partisanship and ideology. And the basic conclusion is that some conspiracy theories are believed more by the right, some are believed more by the left. It just depends which conspiracy theory you're talking about. And there are many conspiracy theories which are believed equally by both sides. So the ones in the middle there, like the fluoride in our water is part of a conspiracy theory, or the Holocaust denial, those things are believed equally by right and left. The ones believed more by the right are ones that either accuse the left or are trumpeted by right-leaning elites. And the ones at the bottom are either ones that accuse the right or are trumpeted by Democratic leaders, right? So both sides believe in conspiracy theories about equally. They just like pointing fingers at the other side. They just believe different things. And if we just take our measure of conspiracy thinking, just getting under the hood and saying, how conspiratorial is your worldview? We've been polling on this for a decade, and when we compare this across numerous surveys to partisanship and people's left-right ideology, we find sometimes it's a little more on the left, sometimes a little bit more on the right, but over time, it's about exactly the same between the two sides. So next, and this is the final claim I'm going to talk about, and that is that social media is driving conspiracy theory beliefs. If you read reporting on the topic, you're going to run into a narrative that's something like this: everyone's great and happy, and no one believes conspiracy theories, and then they go on the internet, and then all of a sudden you get that. It's the internet is making people go bonkers. Well, if you can read that, it says Bitcoin instead of Bitcoin. It's absolutely true that when we on our surveys, when we ask people how much social media they use and then ask them about their conspiracy beliefs, what we find is that people who use more social media tend to believe more conspiracy theories. Absolutely true. But what does that mean? We are confusing correlation for causation if we assume that that means that they're just going on the internet and then all of a sudden becoming a conspiracy theorist. What could likely be happening is that people are searching for what they want. They go to the internet to get the things they already believe, and because they can't get their conspiracy theories on ABC, NBC, CBS, they will go to the internet where they can get a tailored experience and get exactly what they want. So it may not be the case that they're being influenced in any way. They're just following what tells them what they already want to hear. So what really could be happening is something like this. If you see toxic behavior, conspiracy theories, whatnot on the internet, it's because those are the people getting on the internet, right? It's not necessarily a broad sample of people who spend all their time on social media. So we're left with this question. I mean, is internet use a symptom or a cause of conspiracy theorizing? And basically a lot of the evidence right now is coming down to people are opting in to what they want to see on social media, and the people who are watching Alex Jones or following him or any other conspiratorial content, they already agree with it, and that's why they're accessing it. Because interestingly, if it's not something that you're interested in, you're not going to chase it down and you're not looking for it. And just to put some numbers on this, I mean, before Alex Jones was banned by all the social media companies, his website, InfoWars, was not that popular compared to any major news outlet. So in terms of web traffic, let's say in 2016, I think the New York Times was in the top 10 of traffic websites in the US. Alex Jones, I think, was 328 in ranking, way behind. And he sort of has a monopoly on this. So why the disjuncture between the media narratives and what the data is telling us? Well, negative headlines tend to sell. You know, no one's going to buy a newspaper that says, hey, everything's the same and it's all fine. That's okay, I don't need to read it then. But bad headlines, everyone's a conspiracy theorist. You know, those headlines sell. But those headlines rarely have good evidence behind them. Another thing to really keep in mind is that social media companies are disruptive. They're disrupting the old media. And newspapers and broadcast TV don't like it. And they tend to blame social media companies for the decline in their business. And that's why it's very easy for them to point the finger at social media and say, they're the ones driving all of this. Of course, the mainstream news outlets are often just as guilty. How much alien coverage has there been in the Washington Post and New York Times in the last 4 years? Quite a bit, pushing the idea that there's some big alien cover-up. They do it when it suits their purposes. And I'll leave you with this. There's been a long, long line of tech panics, whether it was radio, TV, cable news, you name it. People always blame the new thing for every long-standing social ill, right? We always love blaming the new thing. It's sort of funny now. I see parents saying, you know, in my days, you know, kids just watched television all day and we were fine. Why do they have to go on the internet? Of course, when I was a kid, it was like, why are you watching TV? It's going to kill you, you know. Go outside and play. So each new technology becomes ingrained in us. We accept it, and then a few decades later, it's safe and fine, and we move on, right? And that will happen here too. It's just right now we're sort of in the midst of a panic about it. And just to put an exclamation point on that, novels were considered deadly about 120 years ago. Too much novel reading is leading people to commit suicide or leading them into terrible behaviors. And I don't think this is true at all, but it was in a major newspaper. Novel reading leads kid to chop his own head off. I doubt that really happened. But you can find lots and lots of articles saying exactly this with every form of communication technology going back the last 150 years. So I will leave you with good news and bad news. Which would you prefer first? I'll give you the good news. The good news, things aren't getting worse. Now here's the bad news. Things were always this bad in terms of Americans' beliefs in conspiracy theories. It's just we weren't really paying attention 10, 15, 20 years ago. And now we are. And now that we're focusing on it, we're seeing it everywhere, so it feels like there's more, but that's just sort of our confirmation bias. It's because we're paying more attention. It was always there. You know, so if you want to test this out, at Thanksgiving, when you're there with your extended family, after a few bottles of wine go down, bring up a few of your favorite conspiracy theories and then see how the discussion goes. I did this the last time I was invited to Thanksgiving dinner. That was 9 years ago. So with that, thank you for listening, and I'll take all your questions. So the question is, how do we do our polls? Who do we send them to, and how do they gather? So it used to be the case that polls would be done on the telephone, landlines, but a lot of people don't have those anymore. So polling has moved to largely online, and it's a very different sampling system than used to be done in the past. So it used to be you'd randomly dial people, and then you get sort of a random sample. Now what we do is we get people to opt into surveys online, and we do it in a way where we match our sample to what the demographics of the country looks like. So all the polling that I do mirrors the American public in terms of gender, race, income, education, et cetera. So we're getting representative samples, but it's just not random anymore. And the surveys are taken online. Oh, Europeans are less likely, okay. So the question is, who's more likely to believe in conspiracy theories? Is it the Americans or the Europeans? And you seem to think it's probably the Americans? Okay. So what I like to say to that question is Americans are exceptional in many, many ways. But this is not one of them. We are pretty much on par with other Western nations like England and Germany and Italy. And there are probably a lot of countries that are probably far more than us It's just, I can't poll in those places, right? So yes, we have it, and yes, we pay attention, and everyone pays attention to us because we're the US, but when we do polls, and I've been polling across a lot of the world now, we're sort of middling in that sense, even though there are certain conspiracy theories that are sort of uniquely American. Like, we have a fascination with aliens that most European countries do not have, right? And the only country that I found that comes close to us in terms of alien beliefs is Argentina. And why, I don't know. I live in Miami, so I ask a lot of Argentinians about it, and they don't have a good answer other than, because that's where the alien bases are. I'm like, oh, so. Donald Trump was a president who, when he got into politics, he didn't have any political experience. He didn't have a ready-made coalition, right? And he had 20 more experienced, more conservative, more Republican competitors running against him. So he had to do something very different to differentiate himself. And he did that by sort of flipping the game on its head. He didn't talk that much about issues, Republican issues, conservative issues. He engaged in a lot of anti-establishment rhetoric. You know, what did he say he wanted to do? I'm going to drain the swamp. Washington's a swamp. He ran against the other side, but he also ran against the establishment portion of his own side. So he was running against the establishment, and he did a lot of it with conspiracy theories in his rhetoric. I mean, during the primaries, he made the claim that Ted Cruz's dad may have killed Kennedy in 1963. And that's just one of them, you know, but almost every speech. This is going to be rigged, that's going to be rigged, this one's a criminal, that one's a criminal. And he attracted people to his coalition who had more conspiratorial worldviews than those who were supporting Kasich or Jeb Bush. They were appealing to very different kinds of Republicans. And when Trump lost, it was his biggest supporters were people who already had higher levels of conspiracy thinking, and they were upset that they lost. And Trump said, it's been rigged. He was saying it over and over again. You had numerous senators and representatives and people in the conservative media saying it. And then Trump said, hey, be here at this date, at this time to do this thing. And then he sent him off. So when I was watching it, my view was, I'm not shocked this is happening. I was shocked it wasn't worse. You know, because it just doesn't normally happen that you have a sitting president saying over and over again, it's rigged, we were cheated, and, you know, and what's he saying now? You know, the other side is the enemy of the people, not Russia. It's Kamala Harris. So across the population, here's what I can say, is that people who make less money and have less education tend to be more conspiratorial in their worldview. But the why that is, I don't fully understand yet. I would like to think that as a person in higher education, that students take my classes and they become resistant to conspiratorial thinking. That'd be great to think. On the other hand, it could be the case that higher education pushes out people who are conspiratorial. If someone said, hey, I want to take your class because I want to find who really blew up the Twin Towers on 9/11, I'm going to be like, oh, class is full. Same thing with income. You know, it could be the case that if you make a lot of money, you feel comfortable. And you're like, what conspiracies? Things are great. You know, I'm drinking margaritas on the beach. You know, that could be true. It could also be the case that jobs that pay a lot of money aren't going to hire conspiracy theorists to come work for them. Like, are you going to hire someone to be a financial advisor if they show up to interview and say, yeah, the Jews control the economy? You're not going to hire that person. So there's forces probably going in both directions, that on the one hand, money and education do positive things for people. On the other hand, it could be that there's also forces pushing out. You know, it would be great if everyone who had a PhD was resistant to conspiracy thinking, but I could invite you to a faculty meeting sometime And everybody, oh, the dean's out to get us, the university's out to get us, everyone's out to get us, and it's, oh, gosh, okay, so. We're seeing, so I'll just repeat the question. So why are conspiracy-minded people attending local political meetings? This is a very good question. I don't have a great answer for you yet, but I can give you some speculation. So in 2020, there were, I think, between 90 and 100 QAnon supporters who ran for Congress. I think only 2 of them won, but there were quite a few people. And reporters were calling me all the time saying, why are all these QAnon people getting in? And I said, well, on the one hand, we haven't really tracked candidates based on how conspiratorial they were in the past. So we could have had all sorts of conspiracy believers running for office in previous years. We just may not have been paying attention. I mean, I spent most of my life in New Hampshire. We have the first in the nation primary there. The candidates that you see on the TV aren't the only ones that run for president in New Hampshire. We get all sorts of people crawling out of the woodwork that show up in New Hampshire in February, spouting all sorts of stuff, and they knock on our doors and we shake hands with them. So there's always weird candidates, but they don't get any coverage at all. And we don't pay attention to them. So normally in New Hampshire, there's like 50 people on the ballot for the Republican nomination, not just the 8 you normally hear about. So they could have always been there, right? But I think what happened was that people saw what Trump did and that he could be successful, and that he was tapping into something where there was a ready-made audience for it now. And that had the effect of both encouraging people who shared that message to get involved in politics, and it activated people who that message resonated with to go and get involved too. And then you take everything else that's been going on. Like the coronavirus pandemic is something, and I like to put it like this. Like if I was an evil social scientist, the pandemic was like putting everyone in a laboratory and turning every knob to 11. Like, I want to make everyone into a conspiracy theorist. I'm going to crank every knob. Economic destruction, stress, fear of a deadly virus, death, mayhem, and let's see how people turn out. So you have very different things going on, and there are people who, we're in unprecedented times dealing with very strange, stressful things, and there are issues that people want to deal with. And that's the other part of this, right? That we are living in strange times, and people don't agree with everything that the government's doing. So,
are we just stuck with this forever?
I think
It's kind of awful and exhausting.
we will move on. I mean, I think if our political leaders change and move away from this, then yes. What seems to be going on the Republican side right now is that people are saying, Trump still has a hold on the party, what Trump did seemed to work, and hey, if I want to win, I might emulate it. Well, if a lot of politicians keep doing that, then we're going to be stuck with it for a long time. And you wind up with this circle where if elites are engaging in this language, then the media's got to cover it, and then I have to study it too. So I'll be stuck with it forever. So you can go back in time, and there were conspiracy theories on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line, but that was following on a whole long line of other American conspiracy theories, right? I mean, even before the United States united, we were afraid of the British, the French, the Native Americans, the Declaration of Independence. I think the first several paragraphs to me are the greatest political prose ever written in the history of mankind. But then what follows it is a bunch of kooky conspiracy theorists about the king, most of which was not true at all. And the original draft contained like 60 more conspiracy theories about the king, and Ben Franklin had to step in and be like, Jefferson, you're losing your mind. And he had to edit most of the kookier stuff out. Fast forward 50 years. Fast forward 20 years, you got an Illuminati panic, followed by a Freemason freak out, then everything surrounding the Civil War, and then go forward a couple decades, you've got Red Scare, another Red Scare. So people come to me and they say, oh my God, are things worse now than they have ever been? And I say, well, worse than we were killing witches? Is it worse than that? Okay, maybe not. Is it worse than the Red Scare? No, maybe not worse than that. So let me get to the question you might really be asking. So the question is there a relationship between conspiracy thinking and gun ownership? There is a relationship that's rather consistent between conspiracy thinking and the acceptance of political violence. And I think there is some evidence that there is a relationship there with gun ownership or support for gun rights. Now, does that mean that anyone who believes any conspiracy theory is a violent person or going to commit violence? No, it really doesn't. I mean, everybody believes one, if not a few, conspiracy theories. If those all led to violence, the streets would be covered in blood, but they're not, right? So the bad news is, yes, there is a relationship there. The good news is that most people aren't acting on it, even though some do. So his question is, what if you have a family member who really gets into conspiracy theories and it's sort of they become preoccupied with it? I feel your pain more than you know. So me being me, it makes it even tougher to have Thanksgivings. You can't change somebody's mind unless they want to change their mind. So there's no arguing isn't going to get you anywhere, and all you can really do is just enjoy the parts of the person you can enjoy, and just don't deal with the other stuff. You know, the question you're going to have is, do you want to wreck your relationship with your mother? And if the answer is no, then talk about something else.